In the Gilded Cage, of Chicago's most exclusive Italian restaurant, where power was the main course and money was the wine, Ilara moved with a quiet grace that rendered her invisible. Her artist's hands, once destined for canvas and clay, were stained with marinara and scalded by steam. That fragile anonymity shattered when her ex-boyfriend, a man reeking of cheap cologne and entitlement, cornered her near the kitchen doors. In a fit of public rage over a perceived slight, he snatched the plate of leftover pasta she had saved for her own dinner and hurled it to the marble floor. The clatter of shattering ceramic silenced the entire room, every hushed conversation dying at once. "You're a servant," he sneered, his voice echoing in the sudden, suffocating quiet. "Clean it up." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow, leaving her exposed under the glare of 100 judgmental eyes. The silence that followed was a weapon, but what happened next would redefine power itself. If you watch until the end, you'll discover how one man's shadow can become a woman's sanctuary. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Ilara was 26, though the exhaustion in her eyes made her seem older. She had come to the city with dreams of painting skylines, but instead, she now served the men who owned them. Each night at Serafina, she donned a crisp uniform that felt more like armor, building a wall of professional detachment around a heart that was bruised but not broken. She carried herself with a silent dignity that was both her shield and her curse, a quiet resilience that went unnoticed by the patrons, who saw her as little more than a pair of hands. Her solitude was a constant companion, a hollow ache that settled deep in her bones long after the last table was cleared, and the city lights blurred through the window of her late-night bus ride home. The restaurant itself was an oppressive masterpiece of dark wood, low light, and hushed tones. The air, thick with the scent of truffle oil and old money, felt heavy in her lungs. The clinking of silverware against fine china was a constant, delicate rhythm beneath the murmur of backroom deals and political promises. Ilara navigated this world with practiced precision, her movements fluid and economical, never drawing attention. Her manager, a man with a perpetually critical gaze, watched her every move, his disapproval a constant pressure at the back of her neck. This world of excess was a stark, cruel contrast to her own, where a plate of leftover pasta represented a small, hard-won comfort at the end of a grueling 14-hour shift. She was no stranger to injustice. A past loss, a family dream that had crumbled into debt and despair, had taught her the bitter lesson that integrity was often a liability in a world that valued power above all else. This history was etched into the determined set of her jaw and the unwavering clarity of her gaze. It was the source of her fierce, private, moral code. She watched the powerful men she served, their casual cruelty, their easy laughter, their utter disregard for the people who existed in their periphery, and a quiet fire of defiance burned within her. She might be a servant, trapped by circumstances, but she refused to let their world extinguish the light of her own conscience. She would not become like them. Now the world she had so carefully kept at a distance had crashed down upon her. Humiliation burned hot in her cheeks, a searing wave of shame that threatened to buckle her knees. The smell of garlic and tomato rose from the floor, a scent she usually associated with warmth and sustenance, now the smell of her own degradation. She could feel every stare, every whisper that was sure to follow. The spilled food was a messy, public testament to her powerlessness. Her breath hitched in her throat, her hands trembling at her sides as she fought the urge to either flee or shatter into 1,000 pieces, right there on the cold, unforgiving marble. She was trapped, a specimen under a microscope for the wealthy and the wicked. The oppressive silence stretched, each second a new layer of weight pressing down on her. The entire room held its breath, waiting to see what she would do, how she would respond to this ultimate act of disrespect. But as Ilara's gaze lifted from the wreckage at her feet, it was not the sneering face of her ex that held her attention. Her eyes were drawn, as if by an invisible string, to the restaurant's darkest corner booth, a place she instinctively avoided. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows within. A subtle shift in the atmosphere, a sudden drop in temperature, the palpable sense that a predator, long dormant, had finally stirred from its slumber. Something was about to change forever. Her day began not with sunlight, but with the shrill, merciless cry of a $5 alarm clock. The pre-dawn Chicago air seeped through the single-pane window of her tiny studio apartment, a space defined more by what it lacked than what it contained. A thin mattress on the floor, a handful of art books stacked neatly in a corner, and the lingering scent of turpentine from a past she could no longer afford. Each morning was a ritual of quiet resignation. She would trace the frost patterns on the glass, her fingers longing for the feel of a paintbrush, before pulling on clothes that were clean but perpetually worn. The city outside was a beast of steel and glass, a place of immense possibility that had, for her, become a cage with an ever-present, grinding rhythm of survival. The journey to Serafina was a daily descent into anonymity. On the crowded city bus, she became part of a silent, swaying mass of tired bodies, each person locked in their own private struggle. She would press her forehead against the cool glass, watching the grand architecture of the Gold Coast slide by, a world so close she could see it, yet as distant as a foreign planet. The faces reflected in the window alongside her own were etched with the same exhaustion she felt in her bones. In these moments, her artist's eye would awaken, cataloging the subtle downturn of a mouth, the weary slump of a shoulder, seeing the unpainted portraits of a city that demanded everything and gave back just enough to keep you coming back for more. Arriving at the restaurant meant another transformation. In the staff locker room, she would shed her own identity and pull on the crisp, black uniform. It was a costume of servitude, impeccably clean and designed to make her blend into the opulent background. The starched collar felt restrictive against her throat, a constant reminder of her place. As she tied the apron strings tight around her waist, it was as if she were cinching away her own dreams, packing them down into a small, protected space deep inside. She was no longer a Lara, the girl who saw the world in color and light. She was a pair of hands, a polite smile, and a silent presence meant only to serve. Her manager, Mr. Henderson, was a master of quiet cruelty. He never raised his voice, but his disapproval was a physical weight in the air. He would stand with his arms crossed, his gaze sweeping over the dining room, and his silence was more damning than any shout. A fractional nod of his head could validate a night's hard work, while a slight, disdainful curl of his lip could undo her completely. He found fault in the smallest details: a fork misaligned by a millimeter, a water glass not filled to the precise level. His constant, oppressive scrutiny was a reminder that she was disposable, a cog in a machine of luxury that would replace her without a second thought if she ever faltered. The pressure extended far beyond the restaurant's marble walls. A weekly phone call with her mother was a delicate dance of reassurance and evasion. She would listen to her mother's frail voice, heavy with worry about mounting medical bills, and the mortgage on their small family home in a town she'd fled. Ilara would speak in bright, cheerful tones, describing a city life that was a carefully constructed fiction, never mentioning the double shifts or the ache in her feet. The weight of her family's hope rested squarely on her shoulders, a silent, crushing responsibility that made every meager tip feel both essential and woefully inadequate. She was not just working for herself. She was a lifeline, and the fear of snapping was a constant, gnawing dread. In stolen moments, the artist within her would fight for air. In the clatter and steam of the staff break room, she would find a stray napkin and a pen, her hand moving with a life of its own, sketching the gnarled hands of the dishwasher or the sharp, predatory profile of a patron. These small, secret acts of creation were her only rebellion. They were whispers of the person she was meant to be, a desperate attempt to keep that part of her soul from being extinguished by the endless cycle of service and exhaustion. She would hide these sketches in her locker, a private gallery of a world that saw her as invisible, proof that she was still watching, still feeling, still there. The dining room was a theater of power, and she had a front-row seat to its casual savagery. She moved between tables, refilling glasses of wine that cost more than her weekly rent, and listened to the low murmur of conversations that shaped the city. Men in bespoke suits made deals that would ruin lives, laughing as they did so. They treated her with a polite condescension that was somehow more insulting than outright rudeness, their eyes looking through her as if she were part of the furniture. She saw the rot beneath the gilded surface, the moral decay masked by expensive cologne and feigned civility. A quiet, steady anger simmered within her, a fierce sense of justice in a world that had none. As her 14th hour on her feet drew to a close, a profound weariness settled into her very marrow. The last patrons had finally departed, leaving behind a wake of cigar smoke and the ghosts of their laughter. The kitchen staff was cleaning up, the sounds of their work a familiar, comforting rhythm. All Alara wanted was the small comfort she had promised herself, a plate of leftover pasta puttanesca, saved by the kindly head chef. It was more than just food. It was a small, tangible reward for surviving another day, a moment of peace she could savor on the long bus ride home. This simple plate represented a brief respite, a tiny island of solace in an ocean of obligation. That was when he appeared, a ghost from a past she had fought to bury. Her ex-boyfriend Mark blocked her path to the kitchen doors, his presence filling the now empty dining room with a cheap, aggressive energy. His smile was a sneer, his eyes holding a familiar, possessive resentment. He had seen her through the restaurant's grand windows and had waited, fueled by alcohol and a bruised ego. "Still playing the servant, I see," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. He was everything she had run from, a man who saw her strength as a threat and her kindness as a weakness to be exploited. A cold dread coiled in her stomach. She knew this encounter would not end peacefully. His anger, simmering for months, finally boiled over. His eyes fell on the plate she held, and a cruel understanding dawned on his face. He saw it not as her dinner, but as another symbol of her lowly station. With a sudden, violent motion, he snatched the plate from her hands. The porcelain, still warm, was ripped from her grasp before she could react. For a heart-stopping second, it hung in the air between them, a fragile offering in a space charged with malice. Then, he hurled it downward. The shattering crash on the marble floor was like a gunshot in the cavernous silence, a sound that broke more than just a dish. It broke the fragile peace she had fought so hard to maintain, leaving her utterly exposed. From the restaurant's darkest corner, a shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom. It was not a sudden movement, but a deliberate, uncoiling of presence that drew every eye in the room. The man who sat there nightly, a figure spoken of only in hushed whispers, was Alessandro Gallo. He was a myth made of bespoke wool and quiet violence, a king who ruled from a throne of dark leather. Until this moment, he had been a part of the opulent scenery, an untouchable portrait of power. But the sound of shattering porcelain had been a summons, a disruption in his controlled world. Now, as he rose to his full, imposing height, the oppressive silence in the room shifted from one of social awkwardness to one of primal fear. He moved with a lethal calm, a predator weaving through a frozen herd. The space around him seemed to bend to his will, waiters flattening themselves against walls, their practiced poise dissolving into raw apprehension. He wore a suit the color of a moonless night, tailored so perfectly it seemed a part of him, an extension of his own disciplined form. His steps on the marble floor were soundless, a testament to a life lived in the spaces between noise, a life of calculated, silent action. He was not walking toward the confrontation. He was the confrontation, a physical embodiment of consequence approaching the source of the disturbance. For him, this was not a matter of chivalry, but of order, his order. Alara watched him approach, her heart hammering against her ribs with a frantic, suffocating rhythm. The burning shame on her cheeks was instantly cooled by a wave of pure, cold dread. She had seen this man before, of course, a silent fixture in her periphery, but she had never truly looked at him. To look at him was to invite a danger she could not comprehend. Now that danger was walking directly toward her, his face a mask of detached indifference that was somehow more terrifying than any overt expression of anger. The world shrank to the space between them, the air growing thin and electric, charged with the immense, unspoken power he carried like a shroud. His attention, however, was not on her. It was fixed solely on Mark, whose drunken bravado began to curdle into confusion, and then outright terror. Alessandro stopped, his shadow falling over the smaller man like a final judgment. He did not speak. He simply lifted his hand, a large, elegant hand that bore the faint, silvery traces of old scars across the knuckles. Adorned with a single, severe onyx ring, it came to rest on Mark's shoulder. There was no aggression in the movement, only an absolute, bone-deep certainty. The pressure was gentle at first, a mere suggestion, but it carried the implicit threat of a collapsing star. Mark's sneer evaporated, his face losing all color as he felt the true nature of the man he had provoked. Then Alessandro spoke, and his voice was the sound of gravel turning under deep water, a low, chilling murmur that somehow filled the entire cavernous room. "You are correct," he said, the words precise and devoid of emotion. "She serves." His gaze remained locked on Mark, a predator hypnotizing its prey. "But she does not kneel." The sentence hung in the air, a decree and a condemnation all in one. For Ilara, the words were a shield she had not asked for, thrown up by a force she could not possibly understand. He was defending her, but the defense itself felt like a claiming, a statement of ownership over the very air she breathed, over the dignity that had just been stripped from her. With a fluid, undeniable strength, he pressed down. Mark's knees buckled as if his strings had been cut, the pressure on his shoulder forcing him toward the floor without a single word of protest. His face was now inches from the scattered pasta and shattered ceramic. "Now," Alessandro continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a private sentence delivered in a public forum, "you will eat from the floor." The command was not a suggestion. It was an alteration of reality. In that moment, the universe consisted only of Alessandro's will, and Mark's complete and utter submission to it. The humiliation was reversed, amplified and perfected, with a terrifying artistic cruelty that left Ilara breathless. Before Mark could even process the order, two other men materialized from the restaurant's periphery. They were dressed as impeccably as Alessandro, their movements seamless and silent. They flanked Mark, lifting him from his knees with an efficient, impersonal strength. There was no struggle. There was no sound. One moment he was a whimpering mess on the floor, and the next he was being guided, inexorably, toward a side exit, his existence erased from the room as cleanly as a smudge from glass. The entire event, from start to finish, had taken less than a minute, a silent, brutal ballet of power that left the remaining patrons in stunned, reverent silence. With the disruption removed, Alessandro's gaze, as cold and gray as a winter lake, finally settled on Ilara. It was the first time he had truly looked at her, and the intensity of his focus was a physical force. He saw past the uniform, past the waitress, past the shame that still lingered in her eyes. He saw the tremor in her hands, yes, but he also saw the unbroken steel behind it, a quiet, fierce defiance he had not encountered in a decade of ruling the city's underbelly. It was the look of someone who had nothing and would therefore surrender nothing. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes, a momentary disruption in his own formidable composure. She met his gaze, unable to look away. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, the vast, dangerous drop pulling at her. His eyes held no warmth, no pity, only a deep, ancient understanding of pain and a chillingly calm assessment. She felt utterly transparent, as if he could see every scar on her soul, every secret fear she held locked away. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now mingled with a strange, terrifying sense of recognition. In his profound and dangerous solitude, she saw a distorted reflection of her own. He was the darkness to her light, yet they were both defined by the worlds they inhabited alone. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, not to her, but toward his own untouched table in the corner. It was not a question or an invitation, but a silent command that was also impossibly an offer of sanctuary. Then he turned his back to her and walked back to his booth, the spell broken. He moved with the same deliberate grace, reclaiming his throne in the shadows as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. The echo of his presence remained, a permanent shift in the atmosphere of the room. The shattered plate was still on the floor, but it was no longer a symbol of her humiliation. It was an altar upon which her old life had just been sacrificed. The days that followed were a study in dissonance. Ilara moved through her shifts at Serafina in a state of hyper-awareness, the memory of the shattered plate, a permanent crack in the foundation of her routine. The restaurant, once a place of oppressive but predictable order, now felt like a stage where she was the unwilling lead. Her manager, Mr. Henderson, no longer hovered with his usual disdain. Instead, he offered a wide, fearful berth, his eyes skittering away from hers, as if she were a conduit for a dangerous power he couldn't comprehend. The other staff treated her with a new, cautious respect that felt more isolating than their previous indifference. She was no longer invisible, but she had become a ghost of a different sort, a specter of Alessandro Gaio's silent, terrifying authority. He continued to occupy his corner booth, a fixed point in her chaotic new reality. She tried to avoid his section, her hands trembling slightly whenever she had to pass his table. Yet, she could feel his gaze on her, a physical weight against her back. It was not a leering or possessive look, but something far more unsettling. It was analytical, patient, and deeply searching. He watched her as a master craftsman might study a rare, intricate piece of clockwork, trying to understand the delicate mechanism that made it function. The silence that stretched between them across the opulent dining room was a living thing, thick with unspoken questions, and the profound, dangerous truth of what he had done for her. Her fear was a constant, cold companion, but it was no longer simple. It had become a complex, tangled thing, interwoven with a thread of reluctant gratitude. He was a monster, a man who commanded violence with a whisper, yet his violence had been her shield. This paradox tormented her during the long, sleepless hours in her small apartment. She would stare at the ceiling, replaying the moment he'd forced Mark to his knees, and a shiver would trace its way down her spine, a tremor born of both terror and a strange, shameful sense of vindication. She hated what he was, but she could not bring herself to hate what he had done. This moral ambiguity was a poison, seeping slowly into the clear waters of her conscience. The coincidences began a week later. Leaving the restaurant late one night, the biting Chicago wind whipping at her thin coat, she saw him standing across the street, shrouded in the steam rising from a subway grate. He wasn't looking at her, but at the skyline, a solitary figure in a perfectly tailored overcoat. He seemed carved from the city's own granite and shadow. A car, speeding through a puddle, sent a dirty wave of icy water toward the curb where she stood. Before it could hit her, a sleek black sedan, materializing from nowhere, slid silently to a stop, blocking the splash. The tinted window lowered just enough for her to see the driver's impassive face before it glided away. Alessandro remained across the street, his gaze still fixed on the distant buildings. Another time, she found refuge from a sudden downpour in a small, dusty, used bookstore she loved, a sanctuary of paper and quiet. As she ran her fingers over the spines of old poetry collections, a presence behind her made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. It was him. He was examining a leather-bound volume of Dante's Inferno, his large hands surprisingly gentle on the fragile pages. He turned, his gray eyes meeting hers, and the air in the narrow aisle grew thick. A fitting choice, she heard herself say, the words escaping before she could stop them. A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps even amusement, softened the hard lines of his face for a fraction of a second. "Some of us," he replied, his voice a low rumble, "prefer to know our enemy." That brief exchange haunted her more than his violence had. In the quiet, book-scented air, stripped of his usual context of power and fear, she had glimpsed something else. A flicker of a soul burdened by its own darkness, a self-awareness that was both profound and chilling. He was not just a brute. He was an intelligent, perhaps even lonely king in a kingdom of his own making. The thought was terrifying because it made him human. It made the pull she felt toward his quiet intensity, his dangerous calm, something she could no longer dismiss as mere fear. It was becoming a fascination, a perilous curiosity about the man behind the myth. He, in turn, found himself increasingly destabilized by her. Ilara was an anomaly in his world of transactions and betrayals. She possessed a form of wealth he could neither purchase nor command, an unyielding moral core. He began to see her everywhere, not because he was always following, but because she now inhabited his thoughts. He would sit in his stark, minimalist office high above the city, the silent hum of his empire surrounding him, and see her face reflected in the dark glass of the window. He saw the defiance in her eyes, the quiet dignity in her posture, the way her hands, though roughened by work, still moved with an artist's grace. She was a reminder of a world he had long since abandoned. His life was a fortress built of control, its walls fortified by routine, discipline, and a necessary emotional detachment. Elara was a crack in that fortress. Her existence challenged the cynical truths upon which he had built his entire life. She was honest in a world of liars, compassionate in a city of predators. When he looked at her, he felt the ghostly ache of wounds he thought had scarred over decades ago, the memory of a boy who had once believed in something other than power. This stirring of dormant feeling was a vulnerability he could not afford, a weakness his enemies would exploit without hesitation. He knew he should stay away, that she was a light that would only serve to make his own darkness more visible. Yet he could not. He found himself orchestrating these near encounters, drawn by a force he refused to name. He would have his driver take a different route home, one that passed by her bus stop, just to catch a fleeting glimpse of her tired profile against the window. He sent a silent donation, funneled through 3 anonymous charities, that paid off the mortgage on her mother's house, a protective gesture she would never know came from him. These were his secret transgressions, his private acts of penance. He was tethering himself to her, weaving her into the fabric of his life, even as every instinct for survival screamed at him to cut the thread before it became a chain. One evening at the restaurant, a rival of his, a brutish man named Petar, dined at a table in her section. Alessandro watched from his corner, his entire body going rigid. He saw the way Petar's eyes lingered on Elara, the casual, proprietary way he tried to touch her arm as she poured his wine. He saw Elara flinch away, her face a mask of polite professionalism that couldn't quite hide her revulsion. A cold, possessive fury, so primal it shocked him, surged through Alessandro. In his world, Elara was now under his protection. That meant she was his to protect, and that simple fact made her a target. Peter was not just disrespecting a waitress, he was testing the boundaries of Alessandro Gallo's territory. Elara felt the shift in the room's atmosphere long before she understood its source. The air grew heavy, charged with a new and predatory tension. Petar's smile was oily, his compliments laced with a thinly veiled menace. She performed her duties with a practiced calm, but her hands trembled as she cleared his plates. She could feel Alessandro's eyes on them both, a silent, burning intensity that was both a comfort and a threat. She was trapped between 2 titans, a pawn in a game whose rules she did not know. The luxury of the restaurant suddenly felt like a gilded cage, and she realized with a sickening lurch that the bars had just been locked. Later, as Petar was leaving, he paused near Alessandro's table. The 2 men exchanged no words, only a long, silent look that was a declaration of war. It was a promise of future violence, a negotiation conducted in a language of pure, murderous intent. Elara, watching from the service station, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She understood then that Alessandro's protection was not a gift. It was a brand. He had marked her as his, and in doing so he had painted a target on her back for every enemy who wished to see him fall. Her world had not just collided with his, it had been irrevocably consumed by it. The tension between them grew with each passing day. It was in the way his gaze would find hers across the crowded room, holding it for a beat, longer than necessary, a silent conversation passing between them. It was in the accidental brush of his hand against hers as he passed her a menu, a brief, electric contact that sent a jolt through her entire body. The physical space between them seemed to shimmer with unspoken energy, a mixture of fear and a deep, magnetic pull. She found herself cataloging the details of his face, the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the weary lines around his eyes, the severe set of his mouth that, on rare occasions, threatened to soften. He began leaving books for her at his table, tucked beside the generous tip. There was no note, no explanation. First, a collection of Rilke's poems on solitude. Then, a heavy art book on the chiaroscuro techniques of Caravaggio, a painter of dramatic, violent scenes illuminated by a single, divine source of light. She understood the message instantly. He saw her. He saw the artist she kept hidden, and he was speaking to her in the only language he dared to use, a language of shadow and light, of beauty found in the darkest of places. Each book was a confession, a bridge between their two desolate worlds, and with each one, she felt the foundations of her resistance crumble a little more. She fought against it, clinging to her moral certainty like a castaway to a piece of wreckage. This man was a killer, a purveyor of fear and corruption. To feel anything for him other than revulsion was a betrayal of everything she believed in. And yet, she could not deny the nascent sense of safety she felt in his presence, nor the intoxicating feeling of being truly seen for the first time in years. Her heart was a battlefield, her principles at war, with an undeniable, dangerous empathy for the monster in the corner booth. She was losing herself in the gray expanse of his eyes, drowning in the moral ambiguity he represented. The growing connection did not go unnoticed. The whispers in the kitchen grew louder, tinged with awe and fear. Her solitary existence was now the subject of intense speculation. She felt like an exhibit, a strange creature captured and put on display. The isolation was profound. She had no one to talk to, no one who could possibly understand the terrifying, exhilarating tightrope she was walking. Her life was no longer her own. It was a narrative being written by a man who never spoke, a story whose next chapter she both craved and dreaded in equal measure. The act concluded on a cold, rain-lashed Tuesday night. The alley behind the restaurant, usually empty save for overflowing dumpsters, held a new kind of darkness. As she stepped out into the night, her shift finally over, two figures detached themselves from the shadows. They were not Alessandro's men. Their suits were cheaper, their movements cruder. One of them smiled, a gold tooth glinting in the dim light. "Mr. Gallo seems to have a new favorite thing," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sneer. "We just want to take a closer look." Panic, sharp and absolute, seized Alara's throat. Before she could scream, a black car, silent as a shark, glided to the end of the alley, its headlights cutting through the darkness and pinning the men in their glare. The back door swung open, and Alessandro Gallo leaned out, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. "Get in the car, Alara," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. It was not a request, it was the only move left on the board. For a frozen moment, time itself seemed to fracture. Ilara stood, trapped between the immediate, grubby threat of Pitar's men and the far greater, more terrifying danger emanating from the open car door. The alley was a vacuum, the rain a distant hiss. Her survival instinct screamed at her to run, to disappear back into the anonymity she had always known. But looking at Alessandro, at the absolute, chilling certainty in his eyes, she understood there was no going back. In a single, fluid motion that felt like a surrender and a choice, all at once, she broke from the men's grasp and slid into the car, the heavy thud of the door sealing her inside his world forever. The transgression was not just entering his car, it was choosing his darkness over theirs. The interior of the sedan was a silent, refrigerated tomb. The scent of expensive leather and something else, the cold, metallic smell of power, filled her lungs, a stark contrast to the garbage-strewn alley. Through the rain-streaked window, the world outside seemed distorted, a violent pantomime playing out on a distant stage. The two thugs were frozen in the car's headlights, their cheap bravado stripped away, leaving them looking like startled, pathetic animals. Alara pressed herself against the far door, her breath misting the cold glass, every nerve ending alight, with a fear so profound it was almost calm. She was a captive in her own rescue, a passenger in a vehicle driving straight toward a fate she could no longer control. But Alessandro did not drive away. In a move that defied all logic, all the cold, calculated strategy she had come to associate with him, he stepped out of the car and into the rain. He left the door open, a silent promise of his return, and walked toward the two men. He moved without haste, his bespoke suit shedding the downpour as if it were an irrelevant nuisance. This was a king descending from his throne to dispense justice with his own hands. It was a flagrant breach of his own code, a public display of personal investment. He was not sending a message through his soldiers, he was becoming the message. And in that moment, Elara knew this was no longer about territory or respect. It was about her. She watched, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. As the scene unfolded in absolute silence, Alessandro stopped a few feet from the men. He didn't speak, didn't threaten. He simply lifted his hand, the one with the severe onyx ring, and made a small, almost imperceptible gesture. From the shadows, his own men emerged, their movements as silent and fluid as his. The ensuing confrontation was not a brawl. It was a disassembly. It was swift, brutal, and utterly devoid of passion. One of the thugs lunged, and he was simply undone, his momentum used against him until he was a heap on the wet asphalt. The other tried to run and was met by an unmovable wall of tailored wool. It was over in seconds. When Alessandro returned to the car, the rain dripped from the ends of his dark hair, tracing paths down his temples. He settled into the driver's seat, the quiet click of his seatbelt, an unnervingly domestic sound in the wake of such violence. He did not look at her immediately. Instead, he stared through the windshield, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. She saw it then, a faint tremor in his hand, a crack in the granite facade. The cold fury in his eyes was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. A raw, unguarded emotion that looked like self-loathing. The violence had not empowered him. It had cost him a piece of the control that was his armor. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, filled with the soft drumming of rain on the roof. It was her turn to transgress. Her voice, when it came, was a raw whisper, scraped from the depths of her terror and confusion. Why? The word was a fragile, desperate thing in the opulent silence of the car. It was not a question of tactics. It was a question of motive, a demand for a truth that she knew might destroy her. Why would you do that? She was no longer the silent waitress, the invisible servant. She was a woman demanding an answer from the man who had just claimed her life as his own, challenging the very foundation of their unspoken, perilous contract. He turned his head slowly, his gray eyes finally meeting hers. They were dark, turbulent pools of a history she could not fathom. He saw the defiance warring with fear on her face, the question that hung between them, demanding its pound of flesh. His answer was not in words. He leaned across the console, the space between them shrinking until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He lifted his hand, the one that had just commanded such brutal efficiency, and gently, with a reverence that shattered her, he cupped her jaw. His thumb moved to her cheek, brushing away a single, hot tear she hadn't realized had fallen. The contact was an explosion, a silent, devastating confession. His touch was not one of passion, but of profound, aching possession. It was the touch of a man branding his most prized, most dangerous acquisition. His skin was rough with calluses, a testament to a life she could only imagine, yet the pressure was impossibly gentle. In that single, searing point of contact, she felt the entirety of his solitude, his guilt, and a desperate, terrifying loneliness that mirrored her own. He was not saving her from the world. He was anchoring himself to her, the last pure thing in his self-made hell. He was a monster, yes, but she was his monster now, and the thought was the most terrifying and sacred revelation of her life. He held her gaze for an eternity, his thumb stroking her skin in a gesture of fragile, temporary peace. The world outside, the rain, the city, the bodies his men were now silently removing from the alley, ceased to exist. There was only the vault of the car and the unbearable weight of his touch. He had broken his code of detachment, exposed himself, and risked everything for a woman who was his complete antithesis. She, in turn, had not only accepted his protection, but had now accepted his touch, a gesture that sealed her fate more surely than any spoken vow. It was an act of mutual transgression, a shared fall from their separate, lonely graces. As if waking from a trance, he pulled his hand back, the connection broken. The air rushed back into the space between them, cold and sharp. He turned his attention back to the windshield, his profile once again, an unreadable mask of stone. The engine purred to life, and the car glided out of the alley, leaving the scene of violence behind, as if it had been a dream. They drove through the glittering, rain-slicked streets of Chicago in a new kind of silence. It was no longer a silence of tension and curiosity, but one of shared consequence, heavy with the knowledge that a line had been crossed from which neither of them could ever retreat. The city lights blurred into streaks of color, a world they no longer fully belonged to. He drove her home through the silent, weeping city. The opulent interior of the car felt like a confession chamber. The drumming of rain on the roof, the only sound between them. Ilara stared out the window, watching the neon lights of Chicago bleed into watercolor streaks against the dark, wet glass. The violence of the alley replayed in her mind, a brutal, silent film, but it was the memory of his touch on her skin that truly terrified her. It was a brand, a claim, a moment of impossible tenderness in a world of absolute cruelty. When he pulled up to her rundown apartment building, he didn't speak. He simply watched her, his gray eyes, holding the weight of 1,000 unspoken consequences. She got out, and the closing of the car door was a sound of profound and irreversible finality. The next morning, the city seemed muted, the usual roar of traffic, a distant, hollow hum. Ilara stood before her small window, a mug of cold coffee in her hands, watching the gray dawn break over the rooftops. The reflection in the glass showed a woman she no longer recognized. The fear was still there, a low thrum beneath her skin, but it was accompanied by a strange, new clarity. Something fundamental had shifted within her. She was no longer just a survivor, buffeted by the whims of others. She had made a choice in that alley, a step into a darkness that had, for a moment, felt like a sanctuary. The phantom pressure of his thumb on her cheek was a constant, haunting reminder that her quiet, invisible life was a luxury she no longer possessed. When she arrived at Serafina, the air was thick with a fear that was almost suffocating. The staff avoided her eyes, their movements stiff and unnatural. Mr. Henderson, his face pale and beaded with sweat, summoned her to his office before her shift even began. He couldn't look at her directly, his gaze fixed on a spot on the wall just over her shoulder. "Your services are no longer required, Ilara," he said, his voice a strained, brittle whisper. It wasn't an act of malice, but one of pure, unadulterated terror. She was a liability, a ghost of Alessandro Gaio's world, haunting his carefully curated establishment. She didn't argue. She simply nodded, removed her apron, and walked out, leaving behind the only stability she had known. The walk home felt like a journey through a foreign country. The familiar streets were now imbued with a latent menace, every shadow seeming to hold a threat, every passing car a potential danger. She was unmoored, cast out not only from her job, but from the simple illusion of safety she had painstakingly built. The weight of her responsibilities, her mother's health, the crushing debt, her own fragile future, crashed down on her with renewed force. Alessandro had saved her from one immediate danger, only to plunge her into a far greater, more permanent one. She was alone, marked by a man's protection, which had become the most dangerous brand of all in a city that preyed on the exposed and the vulnerable. Days bled into a week of profound and echoing silence. Her tiny apartment, once a refuge, became her cell. She would sit for hours by the window, watching the rain fall, the rhythmic ticking of her cheap alarm clock measuring out the emptiness. She tried to sketch, to lose herself in the familiar comfort of lines on paper, but her hands felt alien, her inspiration choked by a constant, low-grade dread. The city outside was a constant reminder of him, of the power that moved unseen beneath its concrete skin. His absence was a presence in itself, a void that was heavier and more consuming than his terrifying proximity had ever been. She was caught in the aftermath, a survivor on a silent battlefield, waiting for a war she knew was not over. Then, an envelope appeared, slid silently under her door. It was plain, white, with no return address. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she picked it up, her fingers trembling. Inside, there was no note, no explanation, only stacks of crisp, $100 bills. enough money to solve every problem that had chained her to her life of servitude. It was a fortune, a miracle, and a curse all in one. She knew instantly it was from him. It was his way of severing the tie, of cleaning up the mess he had made of her life. It was an act of penance, a payment for her silence and her trouble. It was a gesture of protection that felt, more than anything, like a dismissal. A hot, bitter anger rose in her throat, eclipsing the fear and the gratitude. The money was an insult. It reduced the searing, terrifying intimacy of his touch in the car to a simple transaction. He was trying to buy her safety, to erase his transgression with cash, to put her back in a box, albeit a gilded one, and restore the distance his own actions had destroyed. She was not a damsel to be bought and paid for. The clarity she had felt that first morning sharpened into a diamond-hard resolve. He had shown her that her dignity was not for sale, and now he was trying to purchase it himself. The paradox was cruel, and it was the final catalyst she needed. She did not refuse the money. She accepted it for what it was: severance. A final, clean break from a world she had never asked to be a part of. With a newfound lucidity, she packed a single suitcase, taking only her art supplies, a few changes of clothes, and the worn book of Rilke's poems he had left for her. She left everything else behind: the uniform, the apartment, the ghost of the woman she had been. The money was not a cage. She decided it would be a key. It was the means to an escape he had inadvertently provided. She was not running from him, or from her fear. She was running toward a blank canvas, a future she would finally paint for herself. Miles away, in a sterile office overlooking the glittering, indifferent city, Alessandro Gallo stood before a wall of glass. The war with Petar had been swift and decisive, a brutal lesson in the consequences of overreach. His empire was secure, his control absolute. Yet, the victory tasted like ash in his mouth. He had won, but he had retreated. He had excised the one piece of his life that felt real, cutting her out like a surgeon removing a tumor that might have been his own heart. He had sent the money to keep her safe, to push her so far away from his world that no one would ever connect them again. It was the most disciplined, most necessary, and most painful decision he had ever made. From the window of a bus heading west, Alara watched the Chicago skyline shrink until it was just a jagged line on the horizon. The rain had stopped, and the morning sun was breaking through the clouds, casting a pale, hopeful light on the landscape ahead. She instinctively raised a hand to her cheek, tracing the place where his thumb had rested. The memory was no longer a brand of ownership or a source of terror. It was a scar, a part of her story, a reminder of the darkness she had touched and survived. The profound silence that now existed between them was not an ending, but a space she could finally fill with her own colors. If this story moved you, show your support by liking and sharing it with someone who appreciates a tale of courage and transformation. Comment below with your thoughts on Alara's decision. 5 years passed, each one a brushstroke on a new canvas. Alara stood not in a dimly lit restaurant, but in the bright, clean space of a downtown art gallery, the air smelling of linseed oil and fresh paint instead of truffle oil and old money. Her name was on the wall in elegant silver letters, the title of her first solo exhibition, Chiaroscuro Hearts. She moved through the small, appreciative crowd with a quiet confidence that was entirely her own, the ghost of the timid waitress long since exorcised. She had used his money not as a crutch, but as a ladder, climbing out of the life that had been chosen for her, and into one she had meticulously, bravely built for herself. The tremors in her hands were gone, replaced by the steady, sure grace of an artist who had found her voice. The centerpiece of the collection drew the most attention, a large canvas that dominated the far wall. It was not a portrait, but an impression, a study in shadow and light. It depicted a dark, luxurious corner of a restaurant, the background blurred into obscurity. The focus was a man's hand resting on a white tablecloth, a single, severe onyx ring on his finger. The hand was not menacing. It was still, patient, a study in contained power. From the shadows behind it, a faint, almost imperceptible light seemed to emanate, illuminating the space around a single, shattered plate on a marble floor. The painting was titled Sanctuary in Shadow, and it was the only piece that was not for sale. It was a testament, a memory, a debt. Then, the low murmur of the gallery seemed to quiet, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that she felt in her bones. A figure stood silhouetted against the bright gallery entrance, a man whose presence seemed to absorb the light around him. He wore a suit the color of a moonless night, tailored with a precision that was both an armor and a statement. As he moved into the room, the crowd parted for him instinctively, a silent, unconscious deference to an apex predator. Alara's breath caught in her throat, the wine glass in her hand feeling impossibly heavy. It was him. Alessandro Gallo looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, but the same profound, dangerous stillness radiated from him, a quiet storm at the center of the room. He did not look for her. His gaze, as gray and steady as ever, was fixed on the canvas, on her painting. He walked toward it with that same deliberate, soundless grace she remembered, stopping before it as if it were an altar. He stood there for a long time, utterly still, a solitary figure in a world of his own making, now face to face with his own reflection through her eyes. In the deep shadows and the fragile light of her painting, he was not the monster the city whispered of, but the protector she had known for a single, transformative moment. He was seeing the profound loneliness she had recognized in him, the humanity she had dared to capture with her brush. In that silent communion, he was finally, truly seen. Without ever turning, without acknowledging her presence, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod to the canvas. It was not an appraisal of her skill. It was an acknowledgement of the truth she had painted. It was an absolution. Then he turned and walked away, melting back into the city's shadows as silently as he had appeared. As he passed the front desk, he spoke a few quiet words to the gallery owner, never breaking his stride. Alara watched him go, a slow, deep exhale releasing a tension she had carried for 5 years. The door closed behind him, and the gallery's gentle hum returned, but the space where he had stood felt sacred, a vacuum of memory and closure. The contract, signed in silence long ago, was finally fulfilled. A moment later, the gallery owner approached her, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and confusion. She placed a small, discreet red sticker next to the title card of Sanctuary in Shadow. It had been purchased by an anonymous benefactor for a price that would ensure Alara never had to serve anyone again. She looked at the painting, at the dark hand and the shattered plate, and felt not a tremor of fear, but a profound, quiet peace. Some debts are not paid with money, but with the quiet courage to finally see the light. If their silent story has touched your heart, share this journey with those who believe in the power of redemption. Subscribe for more tales that find hope in the darkest of places, and let us know in the comments what this ending meant to you.